October 1962. The White House, late evening. Outside, the air over Washington hangs heavy with autumn dampness. Inside the West Wing, lights still burn long after most staff have gone home. The Cuban Missile Crisis is only days away from erupting into the most dangerous standoff in human history. But tonight, another battle is unfolding quietly behind closed doors. The Oval Office door shuts. Inside the room stand two brothers. President John F. Kennedy paces slowly near the resolute desk, jacket off, tie loosened. His expression is tight, jaw clenched in that familiar Kennedy restraint, the look he wore when he was thinking through something dangerous. Across the room, leaning against a chair, stands Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, younger, sharper, intense. His sleeves are rolled up, and a thick folder rests in his hands. Both men know exactly what the conversation is about, and neither one of them is comfortable with it. Kennedy stops pacing. He turns toward his brother. "We can't keep him," the president says quietly. He doesn't say the name. He doesn't need to. Robert Kennedy opens the folder slowly. On the cover is a name that by 1962 had become almost mythological inside the American government. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, the most powerful law enforcement official in the United States, and, depending on who you ask, the most feared man in Washington. For nearly 4 decades, Hoover had built the Bureau into something unlike any other agency in the world. Files on politicians, files on activists, files on journalists, files on enemies real and imagined. And he kept them all, carefully, methodically, quietly. President Kennedy walks to the window, staring out at the dark south lawn. "He's out of control," JFK says. The words hang in the air. This isn't just a personnel issue. It's a confrontation with a man who has survived 8 presidents and helped destroy the careers of countless political enemies. Robert Kennedy flips through the folder. Inside are memos, intelligence reports, surveillance summaries. Most of them come from Hoover himself, because Hoover liked to remind the White House exactly what he knew about everyone. Civil rights leaders, members of Congress, Hollywood actors, union bosses, and yes, even presidents. Robert Kennedy exhales slowly. "You want to fire him," he says.
JFK doesn't answer immediately. He turns back toward the desk, fingers resting on the polished wood. We can't run the country with Hoover acting like he owns it. It's a simple statement, but it carries enormous weight, because removing Hoover wouldn't just mean replacing a bureaucrat. It would mean declaring war on a man who had spent 40 years building leverage on the most powerful people in America. Robert Kennedy knows this better than anyone. As Attorney General, he technically oversees the FBI. Technically. In reality, Hoover answers to almost no one. Not fully, not ever. RFK walks closer to the desk. "You understand what happens if we try," he says carefully. The president nods once, but Robert Kennedy continues anyway, because this is the part his brother hasn't fully thought through. "You fire Hoover," RFK says quietly, "and every file he's ever collected suddenly becomes dangerous." JFK raises an eyebrow. Robert Kennedy closes the folder. "He's got dirt on everyone." A pause. Then JFK gives a dry half-smile. "Everyone?" Robert Kennedy meets his brother's eyes. "Everyone." The room grows still. For a moment, the ticking clock on the wall is the only sound. Hoover had built his empire on information, information that could destroy reputations, careers, governments, and Hoover knew exactly how valuable those secrets were. which meant firing him wasn't just risky, it was potentially catastrophic. Still, JFK walks back behind the desk and sits down. "You're telling me we're stuck with him?" Robert Kennedy shakes his head slowly. "No," he says, "but if you fire him—" He stops, choosing the next words carefully, because they might determine whether Hoover stays or whether Washington explodes into scandal. RFK places the folder on the desk.
Then he says the sentence that would stop his brother cold. The sentence that revealed just how dangerous Hoover really was. And for a moment, even the President of the United States went silent. Because what Robert Kennedy said next wasn't speculation. It was a warning, a very real one. And it revealed something terrifying about the balance of power in Washington. Something the public would not fully understand for decades. Robert Kennedy leaned forward, lowered his voice, and told the president exactly what Hoover could do if they pushed him too far. What he said next changed everything. The Oval Office is quiet now. Too quiet. Robert Kennedy stands beside the president's desk, the thick FBI folder between them like a loaded weapon. The ticking clock on the mantel grows louder with every passing second. John Kennedy leans back slightly in his chair, studying his brother. "You're saying he'd retaliate?" JFK says. Robert Kennedy doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he reaches into the folder and pulls out a single typed memorandum. He doesn't hand it over yet. "You remember what happened to Truman," RFK says. The president nods slowly. Harry Truman had created the modern FBI structure Hoover ruled over. But even Truman, the man who dropped the atomic bomb, had grown uneasy with the director's expanding power. At one point, Truman wrote privately that Hoover was building a secret police system. And yet, Truman never fired him, not once. Why? Robert Kennedy finally slides the memo across the desk. "You know why," he says. JFK reads it. His expression tightens. The document is not classified military intelligence. It's worse. It's surveillance. Personal surveillance. Phone taps, hotel records, witness statements. The kind of information that can destroy people in a single newspaper headline. For decades, Hoover had ordered FBI agents to collect these reports quietly, not just about criminals, about everyone. Civil rights leaders, members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, and sometimes presidents themselves. JFK flips the page. "Jesus," he mutters. Robert Kennedy watches carefully. He has already read these files. He knows exactly what they contain, and more importantly, what Hoover could do with them. Every president since Roosevelt has talked about removing him, RFK says. None of them did. JFK closes the file halfway. "You're saying they were scared of him?" Robert Kennedy gives a small shrug. "Let's say they understood the risks." The president stands and walks toward the window again, staring out over the dark lawn. A cold wind rustles the trees outside. Inside the room, the tension tightens. Because Hoover's power didn't come from his title. It came from knowledge. He knew who cheated on their spouses, who took illegal campaign donations, who attended the wrong parties, who secretly sympathized with communists during the Red Scare. And Hoover never forgot a name, never lost a document. He built dossiers the way generals build armies, quietly, patiently, for decades. And Robert Kennedy knows something else. Hoover had already used those files before. The most famous example sits in another folder inside RFK's office, the file on Martin Luther King Jr. Hoover believed King had communist ties, so he ordered surveillance, wiretaps, hidden microphones in hotel rooms, FBI agents recording private conversations, collecting personal secrets, then using those secrets as pressure. The message was simple. No one was untouchable, not even civil rights icons. JFK turns back from the window. "How much does he have on us?" the president asks. The question hangs in the air like smoke. Robert Kennedy pauses, because this is the part he hates most. He looks his brother directly in the eyes. "You don't want an exact number." JFK lets out a short breath through his nose, a humorless laugh. "You're telling me the head of the FBI has surveillance on the President of the United States?" Robert Kennedy doesn't soften the answer. "Yes." Another silence, longer this time. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passes over Washington. The president returns to the desk and taps the folder with 2 fingers. "He's blackmailing the government," JFK says. RFK shakes his head slightly. "Not directly." A pause. "But everyone knows he could." That's the real power. Not threats, not open confrontation, just quiet understanding. A mutual awareness that if Hoover fell, he might not fall alone. And if those files ever surfaced publicly, Washington would burn. JFK sits again, leaning forward now. "So what do you recommend?" he asks. Robert Kennedy takes a breath. He had spent weeks thinking about this moment, and he had reached one unavoidable conclusion. "You leave him where he is." JFK stares at him. "You're serious?" RFK nods once. "Until we figure out exactly what he's holding." The president shakes his head slowly. "That could take years." Robert Kennedy doesn't argue, because Hoover had spent 40 years collecting secrets. Untangling that web would take time, and Hoover knew it, which is why he behaved the way he did, like a man who understood he couldn't be removed, not safely, not quickly. JFK caps the desk again. Then he says something that changes the tone of the entire conversation. "What if we start limiting him?" Robert Kennedy looks up. The president's eyes have that familiar spark now, the one advisors had seen during the Cuban negotiations. Strategic, calculating. "What do you mean?" RFK asks. JFK leans forward. "What if we don't fire Hoover?" he says slowly. "What if we start cutting the ground out from under him?" Robert Kennedy's eyebrows narrow slightly. Now this is interesting, because there are ways to weaken a man without removing him. Budget changes, oversight committees, political pressure, quiet shifts in authority. But those moves would be noticed, and Hoover was famous for noticing things. JFK folds his hands. "If he's going to sit in that chair," the president says, "then he's going to remember who the president is." Robert Kennedy studies his brother carefully, because this strategy would provoke Hoover. FBI headquarters, Washington, D.C. Morning light spills across Pennsylvania Avenue, glinting off the stone facade of the Bureau's headquarters. Inside, the building hums with quiet, disciplined efficiency. Telephones ring, typewriters chatter. Agents move briskly through narrow corridors carrying sealed envelopes marked confidential. And at the very top floor of the building, behind a thick wooden door, sits the man who controls it all, J. Edgar Hoover. The office is immaculate, every paper aligned, every pencil sharpened, every file placed with almost surgical precision. Hoover sits perfectly upright behind his desk, dark suit pressed, tie centered, his eyes fixed on a document in front of him. He doesn't look like a man under threat. He looks like a man who expects to outlast everyone else in Washington, because so far he always had. Presidents came and went. Cabinet members rotated through power like weather systems, but Hoover remained. 40 years, 4 decades of watching political careers rise and fall. A soft knock breaks the silence. "Come in." The door opens slightly. His longtime deputy, Clyde Tolson, steps inside. Tolson has worked beside Hoover for years, loyal, careful, and one of the very few people Hoover truly trusts. "Morning, Edgar," Tolson says. Hoover looks up. "Morning." Tolson places a thin folder on the desk. "From the White House liaison." Hoover opens it calmly. He scans the contents. Then something subtle changes in his expression, just slightly, a small tightening around the eyes. Inside the folder is a memo summarizing a recent discussion inside the Justice Department. Budget adjustments, oversight proposals, administrative reviews. Small things, but Hoover knows exactly what they mean. Pressure. Quiet pressure. The kind that comes from a new administration testing its authority. Hoover closes the folder. "So," he murmurs. Tolson watches carefully. "You think it's the Kennedys?" Hoover leans back slightly. "The Attorney General," he says. His voice carries just a hint of disapproval. To Hoover, Robert Kennedy is young, too ambitious, and far too interested in controlling the FBI. For decades, Hoover had operated with enormous independence. Now, suddenly, a 30-something attorney general wants to supervise him. That alone irritates Hoover. But there's something else, something deeper. The Kennedys represent a new generation of political power, bold, media-savvy, confident, men who think they can reshape Washington. Hoover has seen men like that before. They rarely last. He taps the folder lightly against the desk. "They're testing the boundaries," Hoover says. Tolson folds his arms. "What will you do?" Hoover doesn't answer right away. Instead, he stands slowly and walks toward a tall cabinet along the wall, a locked cabinet. He opens it with a small key from his pocket. Inside are rows of carefully labeled files, thousands of them, each one a life, a reputation, a potential scandal. Hoover slides one drawer open, then another. He pulls out a slim folder and returns to his desk. Tolson glances down at the label. A familiar name, Martin Luther King, Jr. Hoover taps the folder with one finger. Pressure, Hoover says softly, is rarely applied in only one direction. Tolson understands immediately. Hoover had already begun quietly opposing the civil rights movement, convinced that communist influence lurked behind its leadership. And the Kennedys? They were increasingly supporting civil rights, which meant their political futures were becoming tied to men Hoover distrusted. Dangerous men, in Hoover's view. He opens the folder. Inside are surveillance transcripts, phone recordings, personal reports from FBI agents, material collected over months of monitoring, some of it political, some of it deeply personal, the kind of information that could shatter public reputations. Hoover closes the file again. "The president wants to limit my authority," he says calmly. Tolson watches his face. "And?" Hoover places the folder back in the drawer. "And the president," Hoover says quietly, "should be careful what he limits." The words hang in the air. Not a threat, not exactly, but something very close. Hoover returns to his chair and straightens the papers on his desk. "Send a briefing to the White House," he tells Tolson, "regarding new intelligence on communist activity." Tolson nods, but he doesn't move yet. "Edgar," he says cautiously, "you think they're serious about removing you?" Hoover pauses, just for a moment. Then he smiles. It's not a warm smile,
It's the smile of a man who has already thought several moves ahead. No, Hoover says, they're not ready for that. Because Hoover understands something about power that few people in Washington fully grasp. Real power isn't just authority, it's leverage. And Hoover has spent 40 years collecting it. Against senators, against journalists, against activists, against presidents. And if the Kennedys truly intend to challenge him, then he will remind them exactly how dangerous that can be. He folds his hands on the desk, quiet,
Patient. Waiting. Because Hoover knows a secret about Washington. Eventually, every politician makes a mistake. And when they do, someone like Hoover is always listening. But what Hoover didn't realize was that Robert Kennedy had already begun planning something far more complicated than simply firing him. Something quieter, something slower. A plan that could weaken Hoover without ever touching his position. And if it worked, the most powerful man in American law enforcement might not even see it coming.
Department of Justice, Washington, D.C. Winter, 1962. Snow falls softly across Constitution Avenue, coating the sidewalks outside the Department of Justice in a thin layer of white. Inside the building, however, the atmosphere is anything but calm. Robert Kennedy moves quickly through the corridor, a folder tucked beneath his arm. Staff members step aside as he passes. The Attorney General is known for walking fast, talking fast, thinking even faster. But lately, something else has entered the rhythm of his work. Strategy. Because while the public sees Robert Kennedy fighting organized crime, pursuing civil rights cases, and managing Justice Department operations, behind the scenes, another, quieter battle has begun. A battle with the most entrenched man in Washington, J. Edgar Hoover. RFK steps into his office and shuts the door firmly behind him. Two senior aides are already waiting inside. Stacks of reports sit across the table. "Let's begin," Kennedy says. No small talk, no ceremony. He drops the folder onto the table and opens it. Inside are charts, budget proposals, oversight frameworks, small bureaucratic changes most Americans would never notice, but each one carries a hidden purpose. One aide looks at the documents carefully. "You're sure this won't trigger Hoover?" RFK leans against the edge of the desk. "Oh, it will," he says calmly, "but not immediately." That's the key. Direct confrontation with Hoover would be political suicide. The FBI director thrived in open conflict. He knew how to win those battles. So Robert Kennedy had chosen a different approach. Not removal, containment. Slowly, methodically, the Justice Department would begin tightening its administrative grip on the Bureau. Nothing dramatic, just structure, oversight reviews, budget audits, approval chains, new reporting requirements. On paper, these were routine governance changes, but Hoover would recognize them for what they were: limits, carefully placed limits. One of the aides flips through a page. This would require the Bureau to submit quarterly operational summaries. RFK nods. And? Hoover's never done that before. Exactly. Another page turns. This section requires the FBI director to brief the Attorney General directly on sensitive domestic surveillance operations. RFK folds his arms. Also something he's never done. The aides exchange glances. One of them speaks carefully. "Sir, Hoover isn't going to like this." Robert Kennedy allows a small, almost humorless smile. That's the point. But RFK isn't reckless. He knows Hoover's reputation. The director has spent decades perfecting political survival. Every president who challenged him ended up backing down. But Robert Kennedy has one advantage. He understands Hoover's weakness. Hoover thrives in secrecy, control, mystery. His influence depends on the perception that he knows everything. But what if the White House slowly begins pulling the curtain back? Not exposing the files, not confronting Hoover directly, just forcing the Bureau into more transparency, more reporting.
More accountability. It wouldn't destroy Hoover's power overnight, but it would start shifting the balance. And once that shift begins, it becomes harder to reverse. One of the aides studies RFK closely. "You really think the president wants to push this far?" Robert Kennedy pauses, because this is the question that matters most. JFK had asked for options, but RFK knows something about his brother. John Kennedy enjoys bold moves, calculated risks, the kind of political chess that reshapes the board. And quietly challenging Hoover, that's a dangerous game. RFK walks toward the window, looking down at the snowy street. "The president understands what Hoover is," he says, "and he doesn't like being controlled." Behind him, the aides continue reviewing the documents, budget amendments, operational oversight language, legal frameworks. It's all very technical, very boring. But sometimes the most powerful weapons in Washington aren't speeches or headlines. They're paragraphs buried inside government paperwork. One aide sets down the stack. "When does this go into effect?" RFK turns back toward the table. "Soon." He closes the folder slowly. "But first," he taps the cover, "we need to know exactly how Hoover will respond. Because Hoover won't stay quiet forever. He never does. And if the director feels threatened enough, he might decide to remind the Kennedys why so many presidents before them left him alone, which raises a terrifying possibility. If Hoover decides to push back, what secrets might suddenly start appearing in Washington? Political rumors, personal scandals, leaked surveillance, whispers that could spread through Congress, through the press, through the entire country.
And Robert Kennedy knows something else. Hoover isn't the only one collecting information. The CIA is watching. Congress is watching. The press is always watching. If this quiet war explodes into public view, the consequences could shake the American government itself. RFK picks up the folder again. He looks at his aides. "Let's get to work." Because the plan is now in motion. Small changes, slow pressure, a gradual tightening around Hoover's independence. But across Washington, in a perfectly organized office at FBI headquarters, J. Edgar Hoover is already noticing the first signs, and he is not the kind of man who waits patiently while someone tries to weaken him. If the Kennedys think they can quietly box him in, they're about to learn how far Hoover is willing to go to protect his empire. And the next move in this silent battle will come from him.
FBI Headquarters, Washington, D.C., early 1963. J. Edgar Hoover sits alone in his office. The blinds are half closed, cutting the morning light into thin gray lines across his desk. A fresh memorandum lies in front of him, another administrative request from the Department of Justice, another request for oversight, another demand for reports, another quiet reminder that the Kennedy administration is tightening its grip. Hoover reads the document slowly. Then, once again, his face shows almost nothing, but inside, the calculation has already begun. For 40 years, he has watched politicians test him. Most of them eventually back away, because sooner or later they discover the same uncomfortable truth. Hoover doesn't fight like other men in Washington. He fights with information. Behind him, the tall filing cabinet stands silent. Thousands of dossiers, thousands of private lives reduced to folders and transcripts, each one carefully indexed, each one potentially devastating. Hoover closes the memo and presses a small buzzer on his desk. Seconds later, Clyde Tolson steps inside. "You wanted me?" Hoover gestures to the chair. Tolson sits. Hoover slides the memo across the desk. Tolson reads it quickly. "They're tightening oversight again?" Tolson says. "Yes." "Justice Department?" Hoover nods once. Neither man says the name Robert Kennedy. They don't need to. Tolson sets the memo down. "So," he asks quietly, "what do we do?" Hoover leans back in his chair. The answer, in his mind, is already clear. You don't confront a president directly. You remind him of the consequences. He reaches into a drawer and removes another file, a thicker one. The label reads simply, "Confidential, White House Contacts." Tolson glances at it. He knows what's inside. Reports from informants.
Political gossip. Private conversations collected from sources across Washington. Some verified, some questionable, but all useful. Hoover opens the file and pulls out a page, a typed summary, not about John Kennedy, about someone close to him, someone politically sensitive. Hoover taps the page lightly. "Washington runs on reputation," he says calmly. Tolson nods. "And reputations," Hoover continues, "can be fragile things." The room grows quiet. Tolson understands the implication. Hoover doesn't need to destroy anyone. Sometimes all it takes is a whisper, a rumor passed to the right journalist, a question planted in the right Senate office. Suddenly the conversation in Washington changes. Suddenly the pressure shifts. Hoover closes the file. "Prepare a briefing," he says. "For whom?" Tolson asks. Hoover pauses. Then he says the word carefully. "Congress." That's the move. If the White House tries to control the FBI, Hoover can remind Congress that the Bureau operates independently. Many lawmakers already admire him. Some fear him, but most importantly, many rely on him. Because Hoover's agents investigate corruption, espionage, organized crime. No senator wants the FBI director as an enemy. Tolson nods slowly. "That could slow the Justice Department." Hoover folds his hands. "That's the idea." But there's something else, something more subtle. Hoover opens another drawer. Inside are surveillance summaries labeled King, Personal Matters. His eyes linger on the folder. For months, Hoover has grown increasingly angry at the civil rights movement. And the Kennedys, especially Robert Kennedy, have begun aligning themselves with it politically. To Hoover, that connection is dangerous. If the civil rights movement can be discredited, the administration supporting it becomes weaker. He taps the folder thoughtfully. A long silence fills the office. Finally, Tolson speaks. "You're considering releasing some of that?" Hoover doesn't answer directly. Instead, he closes the drawer. "Let's say," he replies quietly, "that certain individuals might benefit from understanding the full picture." In Washington, that sentence carries enormous weight because everyone knows what it means. Leaks. Carefully controlled leaks. Information passed quietly to reporters. Questions planted in editorial offices. And suddenly the headlines start asking uncomfortable things. Hoover stands and walks to the window. Outside, Washington moves normally. Cars along Pennsylvania Avenue, tourists near the Capitol, government workers heading to lunch. None of them know that a quiet power struggle is unfolding behind the scenes. But Hoover understands something most Americans never see. The real battles in Washington rarely happen on television. They happen in offices like this one, through documents, through rumors, through leverage. And now the director of the FBI has decided the Kennedys need a reminder. He turns back toward Tolson. "They think they can control the Bureau," Hoover says. Tolson waits. Hoover's voice becomes colder. They're about to learn otherwise. Because Hoover believes he has one enormous advantage. The Kennedys are powerful, but they are also vulnerable, young, ambitious, surrounded by political allies with secrets of their own. Secrets that might already be sitting in Hoover's filing cabinets. And if the White House keeps pushing, some of those secrets might start finding their way into the open. But Hoover doesn't know something yet, not fully, because while he prepares to defend his empire, the world is about to plunge into chaos. Within months, America will face crises that make this quiet conflict seem almost secondary. Civil rights battles, Cold War confrontations, rising political tension across the country, and then a moment that will change everything. A moment in Dallas, a moment that will freeze the nation in shock. And in the aftermath of that moment, the balance of power between Hoover and the Kennedys will shift forever.
November 22, 1963. Dallas, Texas. 12:30 p.m. The motorcade moves slowly down Dealey Plaza. Crowds line the streets, waving, cheering, leaning forward for a closer glimpse of the young president who had captured the country's imagination. Sunlight flashes off chrome. Secret Service agents scan the rooftops. And in the open back seat of a dark Lincoln Continental X100, John F. Kennedy smiles and waves. For a moment, the atmosphere feels almost festive. Children sit on their parents' shoulders. Office workers crowd the windows above. Cameras click. Then, a sharp crack cuts through the air. For a split second, no one moves. Some think it's a firecracker. Others think it's a motorcycle backfiring. Then another shot echoes across the plaza. And suddenly, the world changes. The president slumps forward. Chaos erupts. Secret Service agents sprint toward the car. People scream. The motorcade accelerates violently toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. Inside FBI headquarters in Washington, phones begin ringing almost instantly. Within minutes, agents are scrambling across the country. The suspect's name quickly surfaces: Lee Harvey Oswald. And suddenly, the entire weight of the investigation falls onto the institution J. Edgar Hoover had spent 4 decades building: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In the hours that follow, Hoover's bureau becomes the central force investigating the most shocking crime in modern American history. But behind the scenes, something else changes. Permanently. Because the man who had quietly challenged Hoover's power, who had considered limiting him, even firing him, was now gone. And the delicate chess match between the White House and the FBI director ended in an instant. Just hours after the shooting aboard Air Force One, the vice president takes the oath of office. Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president. Johnson understands Washington differently than Kennedy had. Where JFK was bold and confrontational, Johnson was pragmatic. He knew how power actually moved through Congress, through agencies, through personalities. And he knew something else. This was not the moment to destabilize the FBI. Not after an assassination. Not with the entire country demanding answers. So Hoover remained exactly where he was, director of the FBI, untouched. Robert Kennedy's new reality. For Robert F. Kennedy, the world had changed overnight. The political chessboard he and his brother had been carefully navigating was suddenly irrelevant. The quiet plan to limit Hoover's influence, the conversations about oversight, the possibility, however distant, of removing the powerful director, all of it disappeared in the shadow of grief. Robert Kennedy continued serving as Attorney General for a time, but the political battle with Hoover never resumed in the same way, because the brother who had backed him, who had the authority to act, was gone. Hoover's final years in power.
And so, J. Edgar Hoover remained in charge of the FBI, year after year, administration after administration. The man who had survived Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, now served under Johnson as well. His influence continued, his files continued to grow, and his reputation as the most powerful unelected man in Washington only deepened. He would remain FBI director until 1972, nearly 48 years in power, longer than any federal law enforcement leader in American history. Only after Hoover's death did Congress finally act, imposing a 10-year term limit for FBI directors to ensure no one could ever accumulate that level of power again. Looking back decades later, historians would return to that quiet conversation between the Kennedy brothers, the one in the Oval Office, the moment when John Kennedy considered firing Hoover and Robert Kennedy gave the warning that stopped him. Not because Hoover was untouchable, but because Hoover had built something far more dangerous than authority. He had built leverage, files, secrets, information powerful enough to make presidents hesitate. A lesson in power. In the end, the story isn't just about Hoover or Kennedy. It's about how power really works inside governments. Sometimes it's not the elected officials who hold the strongest position. Sometimes it's the person who knows the most, the person who controls the information, the person who understands that secrets can be more powerful than votes. And for nearly half a century in Washington, that person was J. Edgar Hoover, a man who sat quietly behind a desk filled with files, while presidents came and went. And for a brief moment in 1962, two brothers inside the Oval Office considered ending that era. But history had other plans, because within a year, one of those brothers would be gone, and the man they once thought about firing would remain exactly where he had always been, watching, listening, waiting.